Psalms 14 and 15 form a nice pair. They're both similar in length, and they have contrasting themes. Psalm 14 is classified as a wisdom psalm, but it's also got an element of lament to it. There are two parts to the psalm. The first half is a description of a foolish person, and the second half is the confidence of the faithful. Now, when the word fool is used in the Old Testament, it refers to someone not lacking in intelligence or knowledge necessarily, but someone who is lacking in moral decision-making and clarity and strength. So this is a person who says in his heart, there is no God. Now, that doesn't mean that they were a philosophical atheist, but more as if they were living as if there were no God. And as a result, they find themselves corrupted, and God looks to see if there's anyone who is free from this moral corruption. In fact, there is none. They've all become corrupt. And the characteristic that I want to highlight is in verse 4, that when you give up faith in God, when you have no belief in God, you also are letting go of any moral constraints. And when you act as if there were no God, you can do whatever you want, and that includes the consumption of other people, the objectification of human beings, eating them up, cannibalizing them, if you will, using people for your own gratification. The contrast to that is in the last half of the psalm where the generation of the righteous experience God's presence. He is their refuge, and there is a hope for salvation to come from Yahweh. Note the reference to the poor in verse 6, linking this psalm to the other psalms, Psalm 10, in particular, that speaks of God's justice for the poor. Now, when we look at the lens of the editor, we can see that this psalm comes at the end of the first chiasm, the first 14 psalms, corresponding to Psalms 1 and 2, which also have elements of wisdom and foolishness incorporated in them. While Psalms 9 through 14 show the world of Psalm 8 turned upside down. Psalm 8 telling us this is our purpose, is to rule with God, to steward the earth, to care for the earth and one another well. When we reject that purpose, when we reject our identity as individuals made in the image of God, then we become less human. We become more animal-like, cannibalistic, consuming one another as commodities. Now, this is an overview of the Psalms of Book 1, all 41 of them, and I've color-coded them by genre. And I want to zoom in on these first 14 Psalms so you can see the relationship here of wisdom Psalms, Psalm 1, Psalm 14, similar in length. 1 describing the wise and blessed life, Psalm 14 describing the life of the fool. In between, we have Psalm 8 at its center, a psalm of orientation that tells us this is God's purpose. It tells us our identity, our destiny, and it stands as a psalm of orientation. And on either side of it, we have 5 psalms of disorientation. Now, I should also mention that Psalm 14 is quoted extensively in the New Testament by Paul in Romans 3 as he describes the sinfulness of mankind. But also note that verse 7 suggests the messianic hope. Oh, that salvation would come out of Zion. And indeed, salvation did come ultimately through Jesus, the Messiah. Psalm 15 stands as a contrast to Psalm 14, for it describes a virtuous person, the opposite of the fool. It's classified as an entrance psalm, meaning a psalm that's used as we might enter God's presence in worship, as we might approach his tabernacle, as we might approach his temple, his holy hill in Zion. It begins with a question, and then the rest of the psalm is the answer to that question. The question is, who can live with God? And the answer is, he who walks blamelessly, who does what is right, who speaks truth in his heart. Notice the positive statement of that. Then the negative in verse 3, what this person does not do. Then verse 4, what they do. And then verse 5 again, what they do not do. And then a summary statement that they will never be moved. Notice also the contrasting position of actions. He who walks blamelessly, does what is right, with his words, who speaks truth, does not slander with his tongue. And that correspondence continues, what he does, what he doesn't say. Again, actions, words, actions. So that may be a helpful way to memorize and relate these verses to one another. The final verse reminds us of the person in Psalm 1 who is like a tree that is planted. Likewise, this person will never be moved. What this psalm tells us theologically is that what God desires is not our ritual obedience. What is desired is moral purity, is devotion to God that is expressed in the way that we live. And I see these as 10 virtues: the virtue of integrity and obedience, someone whose inside matches their outside. That's what integrity is. They do what's right. They're honest. They exhibit self-control. They don't slander with their tongue. James tells us that the person who controls their tongue has the greatest self-control. That's the hardest thing to control is your tongue. So they've got self-control. They're kind to their neighbor. They demonstrate humility and graciousness. They respect people that are worthy of respect. They demonstrate constancy, even when it hurts. When they make a promise, they keep it. And they exhibit generosity and incorruptibility. They practice justice. And as a result, this is a person of stability that can be depended upon. As we see this psalm through the lens of the editor, it's not too hard to see that Psalms 14 and 15 correspond to one another. One says mankind is universally corrupt and foolish. The other says, no, actually mankind is capable of doing good and being virtuous. We also note that this is the first of a little mini group of psalms that will speak to the idea of being unmoved or being stable. Also, we see in these psalms echoes of Psalm 5, which says that out of the abundance of your mercy, I will enter your house and bow down towards your temple. We enter God's presence ultimately through his grace. Also would note that Psalm 24 corresponds with Psalm 15, framing this group of 10 psalms with these two entrance psalms, echoing some of that same language. And finally, by way of application, I love the fact that this psalm reminds us of here's how to live a life of virtue and constancy and stability. And it's through this power of making promises, whether that is a promise you make to your employer, to your teacher, to your spouse, to your children. These promises, these vows that we make shape us. They influence the way that we act. Our thinking and our actions work interchangeably. The psalm also reminds us, of course, of the gift of God's grace, that none of us are worthy to enter into God's presence. It is only through Jesus, who ascended the hill and through his virtue made a way for us to enter into God's presence.